What is the most bonkers thing that happened to you or your work and your employer still expected you to continue your workday? Story 1. I started getting contractions while I was 9 months pregnant. In case I went into labor, my general manager began working my shifts alongside me. No, I was going to have a C-section. He made a terrific employer. When my contractions began, my general manager had left to get cigarettes, so I forced myself to push through them since I knew they were Braxton Hicks. When he returns and sees this, he immediately puts me on maternity leave. I see nice. I was at work from 6 a.m. until 10 a.m. that day. Due of the slowness, my general manager departed. He was working 7 days a week to follow my lead, and after about an hour, the afternoon manager who was in charge from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. phoned to remind me that if I had a planned shift until 2, I needed to show up at 2. She said, "It doesn't say so here, so you need to come in," when I stated that I was on maternity leave. I then hung up after saying, called the general manager. Currently 35 weeks along, I work as a waitress. I was cutting fruit while seated. My area director informed me that in order to accomplish that, I would need a doctor's letter. In the opposite sense of the term, the first boss is a real boss. That is the way it must be. The other two are complete jerks. I believe that this is the main factor putting Scandinavian nations like Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway ahead of us in this area. Instead of only focusing on the money, they truly give the community's members welfare priority. I believe they get paid maternity leave for around 2 years. In the United States, we get 6 weeks, if we're fortunate. Story 2. Our final semester speeches in college were worth 60 of our grade. The night before my presentation, I had an accident at home and cut open my skull while taking blood thinners. It was still leaking a day later. I emailed my professor as soon as I woke up, explaining what had happened and attaching a time-stamped picture of my face covered in blood. He refused to let me present without a doctor's certificate when I inquired whether I might do so the next day. Just so the instructor could write on a letter, I had to see the doctor and pay a $32 copay. The medicine Phillips is taking is causing his head to continue bleeding. I can't believe I had to send this letter to you. You need to have attempted to complete your presentation in class. Consider making an extra effort to pass the dean or a security officer. Phillips also offered screwdrivers. Story 3. I was a waitress and bartender at a hotel. A few hours before my shift one day, I began to feel pretty ill. I experienced gastrointestinal problems, but I could tell it was different. I contacted and expressed my discomfort. They demanded that I enter. I was too unwell to drive, so my mother had to take me there. I put in an hour. I reached the point where I was positively vomiting up and informed them that I had to leave immediately, lest I do so on the patrons. They advised me that they weren't pleased and should come visit me the next day. I sent an email the next day explaining this and that when I was suffering with norovirus, which comes on very rapidly. I wouldn't be arriving until after 48 hours. In general, they were unpleasant individuals to work for. Cookie Rude demanded too much and was unreasonable. They inquired for my flight number when I mentioned a vacation I had planned long before they hired me so they could start me on shift 4 hours after my aircraft arrived. They then became irate when I arrived late due to a delayed flight. Well, you weren't planning on spending an eternity at Amy's Bakery? Story 4. Ben and the automobile painting for a few weeks. I've been whining that my mask pieces need to be replaced. After a while, my mask started to leak poisonous vapor, so I stopped painting. Being the exclusive painter for cars, the work was stopped. I was instructed to enter and paint there immediately. I called his attention to the surveillance camera and requested him to repeat himself a bit louder. That day, he let go of 2 individuals, but not me. Story 5. They were hesitant to release us from work hours before Hurricane Harvey was due to make landfall so that we would have time to board up our houses, stock up on supplies, or leave if necessary. Being able to leave an hour early was a blessing. That final statement was intended as sarcasm. Yes, it was a lot of fun. When they announced that it had reached Category 3 that morning, I was piling sandbags at work and listening to the radio. I had serious concerns that I wouldn't be able to leave in time. I had also just relocated to Texas and had no clue where to go, which was made worse by the fact that my annoying head boss had said San Antonio wouldn't be in much better shape. Happy moments. Story 6. Our temporary offices were located in a former college dormitory that had been deemed unsuitable for occupants due to the absence of air conditioning and the absence of ventilation even with the windows open. I couldn't open my window anyhow, since it was right next to the dining hall's air vent. By the summer, we were meant to be finished. Of course, when summertime rolled around, it didn't occur. The workplace was between 85 and 90 degrees, with a humidity of almost 100% and dead air. How terrible was it? Due to heart attacks, 2 of my employees had to retire early. When I used to work in an office, there was one man who simply happened to pass out in the middle of a meeting. When the ambulance was finally called, the thought of the cost he would have to pay for the ambulance was the first thing he thought of when he awakened. It's awful that it's what kids have to be most concerned about. Story 7. At a factory, I cut my finger open with a partly damaged cutting blade, which caused a spare blade that was concealed inside to partially protrude through an aperture. Unaware that my right index finger was directly over the exposed spare, I accidentally grasped the blade and began utilizing the appropriate section of it. I began cutting with the blade, cutting a line from my finger center to its tip. Began pouring blood all over the place right away. I called my employer. I was led into the nurse's office by them. I would have been an incident and reset the number of days from the previous incident tracker for which individuals get incentives. They didn't want me to visit a hospital or any other kind of urgent care facility. I gave in to their pressure since I was a young person, so they tightly wrapped it till my finger seemed to have a cast on it before sending me back to work. Even though it seemed dangerous, it wasn't that deep. It most likely might have healed with sutures. I understand, but I still have a visible scar. This is why I get angry when I hear about bonuses for safe work since I work for OSHA. It should not be permitted because it prevents employees from receiving the right safeguards and reporting injuries that can have serious consequences. Story 8. Last summer, I was employed as a cook at a resort in the Rockies. Because there were a lot of grizzlies in the region where we lived, visitors to the resort could borrow bear spray if they wished to wander the resort's trails. The front desk's new employee was requested to demonstrate how to use the spray to a few visitors in case they needed it. As a result, he accidentally released a large mace cloud as he slipped the lock off. And since the wind pushed it inside, it virtually struck everyone who was dining and working in the establishment. In the kitchen, it wasn't too terrible, but one of the waitresses had a really serious case, so they asked her if she could complete her shift and go on with service as usual. Yes, it is very reasonable. A waitress won't be affected by a spray that is intended to kill a 500 animal. She may complete her shift, no issue. Story 9. When I worked in retail for a major wireless provider, the expectations were always excessive. One particular event immediately comes to mind. Being the only shop in a 30-mile radius, we were very busy every day of the week. We were experiencing our rainy season in the spring when a particularly bad storm hit. All around the city, roads were inundated. The streets were filled with dumpsters. 10 miles distant, tornadoes were observed. Due to the roads, half of our crew was unable to physically get to the shop. They were also given attendance penalties. As the rain lashed the windows, I, the on-duty manager, begged my area manager to let me shut the shop. The electricity flickered and lightning crashed. It wasn't justified, he said. He was around 50 miles away from me. He probably believed I was exaggerating, however. The storm was giving my crew panic attacks. People waited hours in line, and we were understaffed. Either endure it or risk losing your job. Yes, I did quit that job. To me, that sounds like a tit. It had been 23 days since I started working there. I had kidney stone when I went to the ER, who still received a point for attendance. I've never really comprehended this. Why would anybody visit the business if the storm is so terrible that the employees are concerned? Story 10. I was a busboy at a restaurant that is no longer open. One day, when they had roofers working on the roof, I arrived for my shift. They had to completely remove the terracotta tile from the roof portion they were working on in order to replace it. The higher management thought it would be a fantastic idea to do this task at lunch, so they stayed open during that time. They were all unaware that the inside ceiling had fractures in it, and that terracotta tile dust was pouring inside throughout the removal, covering the guests' meals and drinks. Restaurant management attempted to go on with regular service, but the customers were having none of it and just left. Tile dust was all over the vacant restaurant when I arrived, and we were supposed to clean it up before dinner service. I was not given any breathing equipment to clear up that filth, so it took at least a month for my lungs to recover. Story 11. My bank's electricity was off immediately after Hurricane Sandy, 3 days. Naturally, we were unable to do any banking. In order for us to sit in our regular chairs, wear our uniforms, and inform any customers who strolled in that we didn't have power and couldn't assist them with anything, my boss asked that the whole staff report for shifts as usual rather than simply closing. Everyone we saw questioned us in some form or another. Then what the hell are you doing here? I hated it. The upside is that you were compensated for doing nothing. Story 12. Worked for a small graphic design firm. They were often sketchy, employed subpar software, and paid no one at all. However, I didn't give it any thought until the FBI arrived. Evidently, they neglected to pay their taxes as well. My boss was then handcuffed and the office was shut down, or so I believed. Our employer threatened to withhold payment if we didn't do the job from this sketchy hotel room he had arranged up after calling our creative director from prison. Evidently, no one showed up since we all agreed that this would be an excellent time to start looking for other possibilities. Story 13. Despite the fact that the air conditioner failed and people began to faint from the heat, they allowed us to remove our ties. That was kind of you. When the AC malfunctioned, I was working at a restaurant. Over 85 degrees Fahrenheit were present for at least a week. My boss requested that someone come and repair it, and corporate complied. When a patron finally complained to the company about the restaurant being too hot, they rectified it the next day. Story 14. I was a welder at a factory 5 minutes after I returned from lunch, according to. My wrist was burned by a lovely piece of slag that managed to get below my glove. In an effort to remove the scorching metal from the glove, I hastily dropped the welding gun. I made an attempt to hold the pistol in place with my other hand so that it wouldn't fall to the ground and maybe shatter. But I missed the handle and instead grasped the hose as the welding gun's tip swung down, piercing my leg with a hot wire. When I explained what had occurred and asked if I may go treat the wound, I took it out and handed it to my lead. The answer, "You are lagging. Better hit your number then." Not even a bandage did I get. I had 6 hours left and it wasn't recorded. Although that wasn't the greatest agony I've ever felt, I wouldn't suggest it. But now my wrist and leg have identical scars. Story 15. On the day Hurricane Katrina was set to hit, the owner of the restaurant I was overseeing at the time became quite upset when I told him I wouldn't be coming in. He continued to haggle with me since he wouldn't accept it. "Okay, you may work for 4 hours, and I'll arrange for the other manager to cover you. We'll go conceal your keys so that we can have someone else pick them up," he said. "Absolutely." The owner called me because they needed help opening the business after the hurricane damaged New Orleans. I was asking him where I was going to reside while working for him since the roof of my home had been blown up. He advised just booking a hotel, as if I could purchase such a thing with the money he was giving me. Hotels, in my opinion, were mostly filled. I'm unsure. Story 16. In the wall, Mart sports goods aisle, a bottle of beer was spilt and attracted on the floor under the shelves. Dick of Dip 4, actually. It still probably does. We had ammunition to sell, but they never cleaned it. Story 17. I was unloading a supply truck when I saw a construction worker erecting a home. 3 of my ribs were broken, and my sternum was fractured when one of the slanted ceiling tiles fell free, slipped off the top, and struck me in the chest. My supervisor informed me through text the next day that he had heard about the incident. "Are you entering?" When I told him I wouldn't and disclosed my ailments, he understood.
"Oh, sure," was his reply.
However, are you still coming in as I was informed? To mix concrete and pick up rubbish? I need one additional guy. Just some light things, you know. As if I could stoop down right now. So I rejected him once again. Even if I could, the painkillers they gave me in the hospital still had me high. The final draft was accurate. About 2 hours later, I received a call from his wife, who apologized and told me to take as much time as necessary to relax. She also said that her husband should stop being a lazy bum and start doing some of his own job. He wanted me to work so he wouldn't have to. I learned, additionally, I have meetings with clients and now meeting with a supplier. The justification for his absence was that he preferred to remain at home and play video games. Story 18. We were not permitted to return home, even though the electricity went off at 8 a.m. For over 8 a.m. For over 8 hours, we did nothing except wait in case the electricity came back up. Then our supervisor informed us that the workday would be advanced by a whole day if it didn't start by 4 o'clock. At 3:50 p.m., the power came on and we had to finish the whole assignment. Story 19. I was invited to work at a new shop we had taken over when I used to work for Verizon, as a type of temporary manager to get everything set up and teach new employees. The guy who was chosen to serve as the store's permanent manager was an oddball. When there were no people present in the business, he was often quite chill. But even then, he would have trouble setting up his clients' phones. It makes sense, given that he is new. So I would give my assistance. He would schedule a store meeting after the customers had departed. Don't assist me until I want it, okay? Nice to hear. The next day, the opposite would occur. He would struggle, get impatient, and ultimately reluctantly request assistance. We have another shop meeting as the customers depart. Come and assist if it seems like I'm having trouble. Fine. Repeat many times. Eventually, I go inside the shop and he begins berating me for intimidating the other staff and acting like I run the business or I'm superior than everyone else. What a funny thing. For the first and only time with someone who wasn't my younger brother, we got into a yelling battle. And it came to the point where I had two options. Either I choose to disconnect and leave the business, or it was going to go physical. I walked away and called my supervisor from the gas station across the street. I explained what had occurred and that I wouldn't be returning. Certainly not that day. He spoke to me about how disappointed he was and then reluctantly agreed. A few weeks later, the man would be let go because he was the wrong fit. Not like trash. Story 20. We were unable to prepare any meals one day because our oven failed. The management insisted that we remain open since we could still offer beverages, cheesecake, and salad without the cooked components. The day's total sales came to $4.59. The cheesecake the manager purchased for himself was that what in Davy Jones' name? A salad is in his locker. Story 21. Although I was unwell, I was meant to work the evening hours. I phoned that day hours in advance to let them know I couldn't make it in because I couldn't get out of bed and was vomiting up. They knew I was capable since I had been working there for a significant amount of time and wouldn't call in until absolutely essential. They needed me in since a fucking cleanliness inspector was coming in the morning, so I was written up. I found it hard to believe. I gave up soon after. I recently received criticism for missing work due to the sickness. I bulk load bags of sugar onto semi-trailers at my job at a warehouse. Everything must adhere to GMP standards. Thus, any body fluid must be cleansed thoroughly and any sugar discarded. They expected me to travel 45 minutes to stand on top of semi-trailers for 12 hours while watching sugar flow despite the fact that I was throwing. Story 22. The pipeline leading to the sewer burst when I was working at a fast food restaurant, causing water and sewage to back up through the floor drains. I informed the shop manager that we had to shut via phone. Just keep the water out of the eating area, he commanded. I informed him that it had already made its way outside after rising via the bathroom drains. He allowed us to lock the doors, but insisted that we leave the drive, through entrance open. Therefore, we were preparing supper while standing in sewage for passing vehicles. That must violate the health code. Story 23. I used to be attacked by the animals we sold, hamsters, ferrets, and birds, while I was working at a pet shop. No huge problem today, but when I assisted the lady who had brought her dog inside, the dog bit me. Fortunately, the dog was of a moderate to medium size, so it avoided getting in my face. But one arm of mine was covered in large bleeding wounds. My boss instructed me to return to work, get dressed, and then come back out to ring on the register after the woman had made no attempt to apologize. So I did, leaving large bloodstains on my yellow uniform shirt. Story 24. Federal authorities with a search warrant closed down everything in so they could photograph the drivers. We idled for hours before being ultimately sent home at the appointed hour. Long meals and trips to the gym were tolerated, however.